Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You guys keep sending us such fascinating topics, and today we're tackling one that's really relevant, I think, to a lot of folks, American perspectives on Islam. And you even gave us a fantastic jumping off point for this discussion.
Oh, yeah.
An episode of the podcast, Perspectives Unfiltered, featuring Dr. Sarah Williams, a professor of religious studies,
Great choice.
and Ahmed Malik, a Muslim American journalist and advocate. So we've got both the academic and the firsthand experience perspectives here.
Absolutely. Combining those two is always so illuminating.
Right. And let me tell you, the discussion gets into uh, some really thought-provoking areas. It's
Yeah,
anything but simple.
for sure.
One of the first things that kind of jumped out at me was this Pew Research study that Dr. Williams brought up. Apparently, 72% of Americans believe that Muslims face at least some discrimination in the U.S. today.
Mm.
That's a pretty significant number, right?
Yeah, that's a huge number. And it suggests that while some attitudes are improving, we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, there's definitely some work to be done there,
Yeah,
for sure.
definitely.
And, it really kind of hit home when Ahmed Malik said, being Muslim in America often feels like having to constantly prove your faith is peaceful.
Right.
I can only imagine how frustrating that must be to constantly have to defend something so fundamental to your identity.
Absolutely. And it speaks to this concept of, othering. That's a social phenomenon where a group is portrayed as, fundamentally different and often threatening to the dominant group. And it creates this us versus them mentality.
Othering. Wow, that's a powerful term.
It
Is
is.
that like I don't know, like during the Cold War when like Soviet Union was constantly portrayed as this menacing, almost alien force?
Precisely. That's a great example.
Yeah.
It's a tactic that's been used throughout history to justify prejudice and discrimination.
Yeah.
Think about the portrayal of Jewish people in Nazi Germany or the dehumanization of Black people during slavery and Jim Crow. These historical examples highlight the insidious nature and the dangerous consequences of othering, and this directly impacts the lived experiences of Muslims across America.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by how the podcast contrasted the experiences of Muslims in, diverse cities like New York or LA
Mm-hmm.
with those in smaller towns. It sounds like the level of acceptance and understanding can vary drastically depending on where you are.
That's a crucial point. Often Malik, spoke about feeling a sense of belonging and community in large multicultural cities, like you mentioned. But he also shared stories of, suspicion and even discrimination that he faced by Muslims in smaller, less diverse communities.
Right.
So this highlights the need to address not just individual biases, but also those kind of systemic factors that contribute to Islamophobia.
Systemic factors. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, think of it this way. Systemic Islamophobia refers to how prejudice against Muslims is embedded within our institutions and policies, and this can manifest in various forms, from biased law enforcement practices and discriminatory hiring processes to the lack of representation in media and politics.
So it's not just about isolated incidents, but rather the way Islamophobia is kind of woven into the very
Yeah.
fabric of society.
Exactly. It requires a multifaceted approach that tackles both those individual attitudes and the larger systemic issues.
So we've got this kind of historical baggage, media portrayals, and these systemic issues all contributing to this pretty complex landscape of American perspectives on Islam. It seems like there's a lot to unpack here.
There is, but it's also important to recognize the signs of progress and the people who are working to bridge those divides. And the podcast highlighted some really inspiring examples.
Yeah, you're right. I was particularly intrigued by the role of social media.
Hmm.
Ahmed Malik talked about how Muslim influencers are using platforms like TikTok and Instagram to challenge stereotypes and share their personal stories.
It's an exciting development. And these individuals are using their voices to humanize their experiences, showing the world that they're just like everyone else.
Right.
Doctors, teachers, artists, entrepreneurs, people living their lives, raising families, contributing to society.
It's almost like a counter narrative to the often, one-dimensional portrayals we see in the mainstream media.
Exactly. And that's precisely why it's so powerful. By sharing their everyday lives and their perspectives, these influencers are chipping away at that othering phenomenon, showing that common ground and shared humanity that connects us all.
It's pretty amazing how social media can be this tool for positive change, especially in a landscape where, negative narratives often dominate. It
Right.
makes you realize how important it is to, actively seek out diverse voices and perspectives.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that the media we consume shapes our understanding of the world, and so it's crucial to be discerning and to seek out balanced and nuanced portrayals.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the historical context, the media's influence, and the power of these personal stories in shaping perceptions.
Hmm.
But where do we go from here?
Mm.
How do we actually move towards a more nuanced and understanding perspective on Islam in America?
That's precisely what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve deeper into the challenges that Muslims face, including Islamophobia and discrimination, and examine those various solutions being implemented to foster a more inclusive society.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've set the stage, kind of explored this historical context and talked about how these media narratives and personal experiences contribute to this, very complex picture
Yeah.
of American views on Islam.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, let's dive a little bit deeper into, I think, one of the most pressing challenges,
Right.
Islamophobia.
Yeah, this is a huge one.
Yeah, this is a critical issue that demands our attention. Both Dr. Williams and Ahmed Malik, they really painted this kind of sobering picture of the fear and prejudice that many Muslims in America encounter on a daily basis. Yeah, it's disheartening, to hear about these very real consequences of this prejudice, from hate crimes and workplace discrimination to, just that subtle but pervasive feeling of being constantly judged and misunderstood.
And what's important to understand is that Islamophobia isn't just a collection of individual biases.
Right.
It's woven into the very fabric of our society,
Okay.
a phenomenon we call systemic Islamophobia.
Systemic, I mean, that word feels heavy,
Yeah.
almost like this invisible force,
Yeah.
shaping how things work.
That's a great way to put it. Think of it as this web of interconnected systems and institutions that perpetuate disadvantages for certain groups, in this case Muslims. And these systems can include everything from, law enforcement and the justice system to education, healthcare, and even the media.
So it's not just about, one bad apple, but rather the whole barrel, so to speak.
Exactly. It's about recognizing how policies, practices, and even unconscious biases within these systems can really create barriers and perpetuate these inequalities.
Can you give me a concrete example of what this, systemic Islamophobia looks like in action?
Certainly. Let's consider the issue of airport security.
Mm-hmm.
Ahmed Malik shared some very deeply personal experiences of being repeatedly singled out for additional screening,
Right.
invasive searches and questioning simply because of his name and appearance.
Wow.
This practice, often referred to as, flying while Muslim, is a stark example of how this systemic bias can manifest in everyday life.
It must be incredibly frustrating and dehumanizing. It's almost like being guilty until proven innocent.
Precisely. And this type of profiling isn't limited to airports. It can extend to law enforcement, housing, employment, and other areas where Muslims are often subjected to this heightened scrutiny and suspicion based solely on their faith.
It's disturbing to think that simply being Muslim can put a target on your back in some contexts.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you wonder about the long-term psychological impact of, living with this constant sense of being othered. That's a crucial point. The emotional toll of Islamophobia is immense.
Right. Imagine, the constant stress of wondering if you'll be judged, harassed, or even physically harmed simply because of your religion. This can lead to feelings of anxiety, fear, isolation, and even depression.
It's almost like this hidden burden that people carry with them every day.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking.
And this burden is often compounded by the way Islam is portrayed in the media. Dr. Williams spoke about how the post-9/11 media landscape really became saturated with these images of violence and extremism,
Right.
often conflating the actions of a few with the beliefs of an entire faith.
It's like that old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. The most sensationalized stories get the most attention, even if they don't represent the reality for the vast majority of Muslims.
Exactly. And this constant bombardment of negative imagery creates this distorted perception of Islam, fueling fear and prejudice among those who may not have any personal interactions with Muslims.
It's a classic example of how media can shape public opinion,
Right.
and in this case, often to the detriment of an entire community.
And this negative media portrayal is often amplified by political rhetoric. We've seen politicians exploit this fear and prejudice for their own gain,
Right.
demonizing Muslims and using Islamophobic language to rally their base.
It's a dangerous game they're playing,
It is.
using this divisive rhetoric to score political points at the expense of an entire community's well-being.
Absolutely. And the consequences can be dire. We've seen this surge in hate crimes and discrimination against Muslims in recent years,
Yeah.
often correlated with spikes in Islamophobic rhetoric from these political figures.
It's a sobering reminder of how, words have power and how those in positions of authority have this responsibility to use their platforms wisely.
Indeed. But amidst all these challenges, it's also important to recognize the resilience of these Muslim communities
Hmm.
and the inspiring ways that they are pushing back against Islamophobia.
Yeah, they're not remaining silent.
Yeah.
They're organizing, they're advocating, and
Yeah.
they're working to really change hearts and minds.
They're forming advocacy groups, educating the public, challenging these discriminatory policies, and building bridges with other communities.
It's a testament to their strength and determination to create a more just and inclusive society.
And one of the most powerful tools that they're using is storytelling.